Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
It was just after 6 in the evening when the phone rang, the kind of hour where the light softens through the blinds and the air feels just a little heavier, like it's holding its breath. I was standing in the kitchen, barefoot on the cold tile, swirling a glass of Cabernet and listening to the faint hum of the dishwasher as it worked through its final rinse cycle. It was one of those small, ordinary moments where everything is still, where nothing feels urgent, and for a split second, I almost didn't answer the call. The number blinking on the screen was familiar, my parents' landline, a number I hadn't dialed myself in months and hadn't received a call from in even longer. I picked up on the third ring, not out of eagerness, but out of habit, expecting maybe a casual check-in, maybe a half-hearted invitation to Sunday dinner, maybe one of my mother's vague attempts at reconnecting when guilt finally outweighed pride. But the voice that came through the line was not calm or casual. It was sharp and gasping, cracked with panic and desperation in a way I had never heard before, not even in childhood emergencies or those rare moments when my father allowed himself to sound human. "Emily," he said, his voice clipped and frantic, like the words were tripping over themselves to get out faster than his breath would allow. "It's your brother. He's ruined everything. He's bankrupted us." I didn't say anything at first. I just let the silence stretch between us, let the weight of his words dangle in the air, because there was something beautifully poetic about the way that sentence landed, like an overdue punchline to a joke I'd been sitting through for 30 years. I could hear his breathing on the other end, quick and shallow, the kind of sound people make when they're standing in the middle of a crumbling legacy, realizing too late that the person they crowned king wasn't wearing anything under his robes but arrogance and empty promises. And then, finally, I spoke, calmly, clearly, without an ounce of surprise in my voice. "I know," I said, taking a sip of wine so slowly it almost felt ceremonial. "Check your mailbox." There was a pause, and I could feel his confusion travel across the line like a pulse. He didn't ask what I meant, at least not right away, because I think some part of him already knew, some dormant instinct buried under decades of denial, suddenly blinking to life and whispering that maybe he'd overlooked something bigger than he realized. I didn't offer an explanation. I didn't ask for details or pretend to be shocked. I didn't offer comfort or consolation because there was nothing left to comfort and nothing left to salvage. I simply ended the call the way he'd ended so many of our conversations over the years, abruptly, without warmth, without ceremony. Just a quiet click and the hum of the dial tone. Then I walked to the living room, pulled the curtains back just enough to let the fading sunlight spill across the hardwood floor, and stood by the window with my glass in hand, watching the city glow in shades of orange and gold. The world outside kept turning, unaware of the collapse happening behind someone else's front door, and I stood there quietly, savoring the stillness, the peace, the sense that everything was exactly as it should be. Because the truth is, I had been waiting for this moment for longer than I cared to admit. Not out of spite, not because I wished ruin on anyone, but because I knew, deep in my bones, behind every forced smile and every patronizing nod, that eventually the weight of their choices would catch up with them. That the same hands that once pushed me aside would one day come reaching out in desperation, not realizing the ground they were standing on was already slipping out from under them. And when that moment came, I didn't want revenge. I didn't want applause or recognition or some dramatic confrontation where I threw their failures in their faces. I just wanted them to feel what it was like to reach for help and find nothing but silence. I wanted them to understand what it meant to be dismissed, ignored, underestimated, what it meant to be invisible until your absence became impossible to ignore. So when I told him to check the mailbox, I wasn't offering hope or salvation. I was offering clarity. Because inside that mailbox, he would find everything they'd never thought to ask about, everything I'd built in the shadows while they were too busy polishing Ryan's nameplate on the office door. He would find documents, papers, signatures, and contracts he never imagined could belong to me. He would find the terms of the deal I struck with the debt firm that now owned the family business. He would find out that the company he spent his life protecting had already changed hands. And most of all, he would find my name at the bottom of every page. But not yet, not in this moment. Right now, all he had was confusion and dread, and a mailbox waiting quietly by the curb with a truth he couldn't escape. And I had a glass of wine and a quiet smile. Because I didn't have to lift a finger. The long game was already in motion. You don't forget the first time someone decides who you're going to be before you've even figured it out for yourself. I must have been around 8 or 9 the first time I heard my mother say it out loud, her voice laced with that soft, condescending certainty that only mothers like mine seemed perfect over time. She was standing in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, and I was sitting at the table coloring in a workbook from school when she looked up at my father and said, "Ryan will run the business one day, obviously. Emily will make a lovely teacher or maybe a nurse." And just like that, my entire identity was decided without my consent, like I was nothing more than a decorative afterthought meant to be useful, pleasant, and entirely forgettable. They didn't mean it to be cruel, not in the way people usually mean to hurt, but that didn't make it sting any less. It was the way they said it, casually, like it was a given, like my life had already been mapped out, and all that was left for me to do was quietly follow the path they'd so thoughtfully paved. Ryan was the future, the prodigy, the rightful heir, and I was the supportive background character meant to applaud his every step forward. The thing is, Ryan was never exceptional, not in school, not in sports, not in anything really, but our parents treated him like he walked on water just for showing up. He got B's and they called him brilliant. He skipped studying and they said he was just naturally sharp. Meanwhile, I brought home perfect scores and honor roll certificates, and all I ever got was, "Well, of course you did, honey, you've always been diligent." Diligent. Like a secretary. Like a desk lamp. Like a reliable household appliance that worked just fine but would never be impressive. Every time I did something worth noticing, they barely looked up. I won a state-level science fair, and my father said, "That's nice, but Ryan's been learning about stock portfolios." I got a scholarship to a leadership camp, and my mother said, "That'll help with your people skills." Ryan's been networking with Dad's clients. It didn't matter how hard I worked, how many hours I poured into every achievement. I was always second to the boy who coasted through life with a crooked grin and just enough charm to skate by unnoticed in his mediocrity. When we were teenagers, it became even more obvious. Ryan was handed opportunities one couldn't even dream of, summer internships at the company, sit-downs with the accountants, invites to boardroom lunches where he was introduced as the future of the firm. And me? I was asked to help organize files in the back office, take notes during meetings, fetch coffee for visiting executives. No one ever said I couldn't be part of the business. They just made sure I understood I'd never be in charge of it. I remember one summer in particular, just after junior year, when Ryan was given a full month shadowing our father in meetings while I spent my days entering invoice numbers into spreadsheets in the back room. I'd overhear their conversations sometimes, Ryan barely understanding half of what was being said, nodding along like a puppet while our father puffed him up with compliments he hadn't earned. And I'd sit there quietly, correcting the numbers he got wrong, fixing his errors behind the scenes, and listening to him get praised for work I'd done. He'd come into my space, lean over my desk, and say things like, "Hey, I need that report for Dad's meeting. Can you put it together by lunch?" And then take it upstairs, slap his name on it, and hand it over like it was his own brilliance on the page. Even then, I knew. I knew I wasn't invisible because I lacked talent. I was invisible because they had already decided Ryan was the one worth looking at. And the worst part was, it wasn't even about capability. It was about tradition, about legacy, about the old-school belief that the son takes the lead while the daughter keeps things tidy in the background. My mother once told me, during one of her more honest moments, "You're so capable, Emily, but Ryan just has that business instinct, you know, that edge." I wanted to ask her what edge she thought she was seeing because all I ever saw was a boy who played golf better than he read a balance sheet. By the time we reached our 20s, it was already done. Ryan went to a second-rate business school and came back with a degree he barely earned, and they threw a party like he'd just cured cancer. I finished my own degree with top honors and couldn't even get a congratulatory dinner. And then came the moment, the one I'll never forget, the moment they handed over the company like it was a family heirloom meant only for male hands. It was the day after Ryan's graduation. We were in the conference room at the office, the one with the fake mahogany table and the old framed pictures of our grandfather shaking hands with long-dead business partners. My father stood at the head of the table with a glass of champagne in his hand, beaming with pride, while my mother dabbed tears from the corner of her eyes. Ryan looked bored, already scrolling through messages on his phone, barely listening as they made it official. "This business has always been about family," my father said, raising his glass. "And it's time to pass the torch to the next generation. Ryan has earned this." I was standing by the doorway, holding a folder full of contracts they'd asked me to organize, watching the whole thing unfold like I was an outsider at someone else's celebration. No one acknowledged me. No one looked my way. No one even thought to ask if I had something to say. That was the day I stopped trying to earn a place at their table. Because deep down, I already knew, if they weren't going to hand me the torch, I'd just build a fire of my own. There's something strangely liberating about being overlooked, something unexpectedly powerful about being underestimated so thoroughly that no one even thinks to keep an eye on you. People love to talk about underdogs like they're scrappy fighters, loud and fiery and determined to prove everyone wrong with fists clenched and eyes blazing. But real underdogs, the quiet ones, the slow burners, the people who've been dismissed so completely they've learned to stop reacting, those are the ones who move in silence and strike when no one's watching. I didn't build my company to get even. I didn't build it to prove a point or rub anyone's nose in it. I built it because I needed something that belonged entirely to me, something no one could hand over or take away or talk over or dress up with someone else's name. I started in a cramped apartment with yellowing walls and a noisy upstairs neighbor who blasted old rock music at all hours of the night. My desk was a rickety folding table, and my office chair was whatever I could salvage from the curb on garbage day. I worked a dull administrative job during the day, the kind that slowly eats away at your mind until you forget what ambition even feels like, and I spent my nights huddled over my laptop, devouring free online business courses and scribbling notes into a secondhand notebook until my wrist cramped. I read everything I could find about product development, marketing strategies, startup finance, and supply chains. I watched video tutorials in the early hours while reheating leftovers and wore out my library card printing off case studies in the break room at work when no one was looking. Every dollar I saved, every bonus I scraped together, every refund check or side gig payout went into building something piece by piece. I didn't start with a vision board or a 5-year plan or a catchy slogan. I started with a simple idea and the unshakable need to prove to myself that I could make it real. I designed the first product prototype on a borrowed design software trial version that kept crashing every hour, and I made the first batch of inventory from materials I bought wholesale through a sketchy online supplier whose reviews warned me not to trust them. But I did it anyway because it was all I could afford at the time. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't clean or polished or picture-perfect like the startups you see on magazine covers. It was messy, hard, and brutally isolating at times. I worked through tears and burnout and rejection so thick it made me doubt everything I thought I knew. I got ghosted by suppliers, laughed out of meetings, and had entire weeks where the only thing keeping me going was the fact that quitting would have meant proving my parents right, that I wasn't meant for business, that I was just the support act. The warm body in the background making sure someone else's spotlight stayed bright. I was still showing up to family dinners back then, still playing my role as the quiet one, the helper, the placeholder. I'd smile politely while Ryan went on about quarterly earnings and partnerships I knew were shallow at best. I'd pass the potatoes and let my mother cut me off mid-sentence, let my father nod absently in my direction without really hearing a word I said. I wore the mask so well they never once thought to ask what I'd been working on, never asked how I spent my nights or where I'd been disappearing on weekends. And I never offered it. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew what it would sound like to them, like a hobby, like a distraction, like something small and silly that would be patted on the head and gently dismissed. So I kept building. Quietly, steadily, fiercely. My first real investor came through a connection I'd made in a business development workshop I almost didn't attend because I couldn't afford the gas to drive there and back. He wasn't flashy or rich, just a small-scale angel investor who believed in underdogs and saw the fire behind my nervous pitch. That first check was modest, not life-changing on its own, but it was the first external validation I'd ever received from someone who didn't share my last name and wasn't obligated by blood to pretend I mattered. I remember depositing that check and staring at the numbers on the screen like I was seeing myself clearly for the first time. From there, everything started to shift. I got my first client, a small boutique chain willing to take a chance on my product line, and then another, and then another. My revenue doubled, then tripled, and suddenly I was in meetings with distributors and negotiating contracts while still acting like nothing had changed at home. I'd sit at the dinner table hearing my parents talk about Ryan's so-called success, and I'd smile and nod while mentally calculating the margins on my last shipment. I wasn't angry anymore, not really. Just detached. Detached and driven. The funny thing is, people assume you want to be seen, that you're building for recognition or praise or applause. But the truth is, I stopped needing that a long time ago. I didn't want their validation, I wanted independence. I wanted freedom. I wanted a life that didn't depend on anyone handing me a seat at the table. And when I realized I could create that without them, without their input, without their approval or permission, it was like breathing air I didn't even know I'd been missing. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, down to the way the light came through the curtains, when I was sitting in my apartment reviewing a new contract from a second investor who'd just joined the team, and I looked at my reflection in the window and said out loud, "You don't owe them anything anymore." And from that day forward, I stopped building for them and started building for myself. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. And that made all the difference. It didn't take a financial genius to see the cracks forming, not if you were paying close enough attention, and I had spent so many years pretending not to see that I had become exceptionally skilled at watching everything unfold without blinking. The first signs were subtle, small shifts in tone during the rare phone calls my father still made, the slightly tighter smile Ryan wore at the last family barbecue, the nervous edge in my mother's voice when she mentioned that a few orders at the company had been delayed due to a supplier miscommunication. But I had worked hard enough, quietly enough, and long enough to know what it really meant when suppliers started miscommunicating. It meant they weren't getting paid on time, and late payments always point to deeper problems. Still, I didn't say anything. Not yet. I listened. I nodded. I offered nothing but vague hums of acknowledgement and polite comments that gave no indication of what I suspected. Because the truth was, I didn't need confirmation, I already knew where this was headed. I had spent too many nights studying business failure patterns while building my own company in silence, and I'd read enough financial red flags to recognize what was happening long before anyone in my family allowed themselves to see it. Ryan was unraveling, even if no one wanted to admit it. His confidence had grown too large for the foundation it was built on, puffed up by years of unchecked ego and praise that he'd mistaken for actual ability. He wasn't running the business, he was coasting on the illusion of competence, bluffing his way through board meetings, surrounding himself with people who cared more about being agreeable than being honest. I knew he'd made a few risky expansions in the last 2 years, opening new branches without proper forecasting, investing in trends he didn't understand just to make himself look innovative. It was the kind of reckless ambition that only comes from someone who's never had to face consequences, and I knew exactly who had spent his life shielding him from those consequences. But what really caught my attention, what really shifted my focus from quiet observation to strategic planning, was something I learned over drinks one night with a friend of mine who worked in mid-level finance at a regional bank. She didn't say much at first, just mentioned in passing that she'd seen a familiar name on a flagged accounts list. When I pressed gently, she leaned in and whispered, "Your brother's company applied for a short-term commercial loan, significant amount, high interest, no collateral." My stomach didn't drop. My heart didn't race. I just smiled, nodded, and sipped my drink because I had already known. I had seen it coming months ago, the way you feel a storm coming long before the first crack of thunder. But hearing it out loud, from a completely unrelated source, confirmed that this wasn't just a few bad decisions or a rough quarter. This was the beginning of the end. The loan was a desperate move, the kind of Hail Mary attempt you make when you're already underwater and trying to keep your nose above the surface just a little longer. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't call my parents in a panic or storm into the office with spreadsheets and warnings. That would have been the old me, the version of me that still hoped they would finally listen, finally believe that I had something of value to say. But I'd learned the hard way that shouting into a void only leaves you breathless, and even if I'd laid the evidence at their feet, they would have waved it away with another excuse about how Ryan just needed more time or how business always has its ups and downs. So I stayed quiet. I kept building my own empire while his crumbled, brick by brick, decision by decision. I kept showing up to dinners and smiling through conversations about company anniversaries and client growth strategies, knowing full well that behind the curtain, invoices were stacking up and vendors were whispering about cutting ties. I watched my father cling to the belief that his son could fix everything, and I watched my mother continue to boast to her friends about the family legacy, like the walls weren't already hollow. I wasn't waiting to gloat. I wasn't sitting in the shadows hoping they'd beg for my help. I was preparing, calculating, assembling my next move not out of spite, but out of sheer necessity. Because I knew that when the collapse came, and it would, soon, they wouldn't know what to do. They'd panic. They'd scramble. They'd finally look in my direction, not out of respect, but out of desperation, and I would be ready, not to save them, but to make sure I didn't get buried in the fallout they created. People often say that family is everything, that blood ties should be unbreakable, but the truth is, family means very little when your presence is only ever acknowledged in times of crisis. I had spent too many years trying to prove myself in a house that only measured worth in titles and male egos, and I had no intention of playing savior now that the empire built on arrogance was beginning to rot from the inside. I didn't interfere. I didn't warn them. I let the spiral run its course, watching calmly from the sidelines like a surgeon observing a patient who refused treatment until it was too late. Because the truth is, they wouldn't have heard me even if I'd screamed. And besides, I already knew exactly what I was going to do next. There's a certain kind of poetry in watching the people who always spoke over you finally fall silent, not because they've suddenly learned how to listen, but because they've finally run out of excuses. When I told my father to check the mailbox, I wasn't being cryptic for dramatic effect. I was simply giving him a quiet moment to face the truth without my voice in his ear, without my expression giving him something else to deflect, without the sound of my presence making it easier for him to pretend this wasn't real. I wanted him to sit there alone, holding that envelope in his hands, feeling the weight of it before he ever even opened it. I wanted him to feel what it was like to realize the world had changed and that he hadn't seen it coming, not because the signs weren't there, but because he never bothered to look. It wasn't a thick envelope, nothing that looked imposing or dramatic. Just a plain white one with his name typed neatly across the front, delivered by courier and dropped into that old black mailbox that had sat at the end of their driveway since I was a kid. I imagined the way he picked it up, probably thinking it was another invoice, another reminder from the bank, another piece of evidence confirming what he already feared but hadn't said out loud. But when he pulled out the documents inside, what he found wasn't a bill or a final notice or a list of demands. What he found was a letterhead he didn't recognize, at least, not at first glance. A law firm's name at the top, clean and understated, followed by two simple words, purchase agreement. It was all laid out in black and white, no theatrics, no venom, just facts. The family business, the one he'd spent his whole life building, the one he'd entrusted to my brother without a second thought, the one he told me I would never be equipped to run, was now owned by me. I didn't buy it from him. I didn't wrestle it from Ryan's hands in some dramatic boardroom showdown. I bought it from the debt consolidation firm that quietly acquired it when Ryan defaulted on a loan he never should have taken in the first place. There had been no announcement, no need for a public spectacle. It was a simple transaction, a clean signature, a wire transfer that finalized everything without fanfare. The business still existed, still operated, still had clients and contracts and a recognizable name. But the name on the ownership documents, the one that mattered most, was mine. I didn't include a letter inside the envelope. I didn't include a note or a quote or a long-winded explanation about how things had come to this. I figured the paperwork said more than I ever could. I figured the truth would land heavier without me trying to soften it with sentimentality or sarcasm. Besides, what was there left to say that hadn't already been ignored 100 times before? When I arrived at the office that afternoon, I didn't walk in with a parade of lawyers or a new plaque to hang on the door. I didn't bring an entourage or a speech. I just brought myself, wearing the same steady calm that had carried me through years of being spoken over and dismissed. The building looked exactly the same cracked tiles in the entryway, same outdated furniture in the waiting room, same smell of old paper and printer toner clinging to the air. But everything felt different, because this time, I wasn't walking in to take orders or fetch coffee or help organize someone else's chaos. This time, I was walking in as the owner. I made my way down the hallway, nodding politely at the few staff members who hadn't already jumped ship when the company started sinking. Most of them didn't even know who I was beyond the occasional family visit, but they would soon enough. I opened the door to what used to be my father's office, still lined with outdated industry awards and dusty photos of Ryan shaking hands with people he didn't respect, and I didn't hesitate. I walked straight to the chair behind the desk, the one I'd been told I'd never deserve. The one I used to stare at from the corner of the room when I was 13 years old and filing invoices on a summer afternoon while Ryan played golf with clients who couldn't tell the difference between charisma and competence. And I sat down. No one said anything for a long time. My father arrived a few minutes later, face pale, lips drawn tight, eyes flicking across the room like he was searching for some kind of loophole in reality. My mother followed behind him, clutching her purse like it might hold the answers to questions she hadn't even formed yet. Ryan was the last to enter, shoulders hunched in that way people carry themselves when the shame has finally started to settle in, when they've realized that confidence without substance is just empty noise. He didn't say a word. He didn't demand an explanation or offer one of his lazy apologies. He just looked at me, then at the chair I was sitting in, and then turned around and walked out. My parents didn't follow him. They just stood there, staring at me, their expressions stuck somewhere between disbelief and something they weren't ready to name yet. Maybe regret, maybe respect, maybe something else entirely. I didn't say, "I told you so." I didn't gloat or smirk or give them the satisfaction of seeing me victorious. Because it was never about that. It was never about revenge or proving them wrong or rubbing their noses in their own failure. It was about finally stepping into the space I'd always been told wasn't mine. And realizing it had been mine all along. Let me tell you something people don't often say out loud. Sometimes what you want most from the people who raised you isn't their pride, their praise, or even their love. Sometimes, all you really want is their quiet acknowledgement that you were never the weak one to begin with. Not the second choice, not the background character, not the afterthought in your brother's success story. Just a moment of clarity, a moment where they finally realized that the person they dismissed was the one quietly carrying the weight all along. And if you've ever spent your life being overlooked, you know exactly what I mean. You know that nothing will ever fully repair the damage of being told, in 100 subtle ways, that someone else's potential mattered more than your reality ever did. So no, this wasn't revenge. I didn't do any of this to humiliate my brother or to tear my parents down. That was never the goal, not even in the beginning. I didn't build my company to make a statement or craft some perfectly timed downfall for the people who thought I couldn't handle more than answering phones and alphabetizing file folders. I built it because I needed something of my own, something that didn't come with conditions or expectations or comparisons. I built it because peace was never offered to me in that house, not unless it came with silence and smallness and self-sacrifice. And when peace isn't on the table, the only thing left is power. The truth is, I would have been perfectly content to build my own path quietly and let them keep their illusions intact. I would have stayed in my lane, far away from their drama, if only they had left me in peace to pursue my work without turning every interaction into a reminder that I wasn't who they wanted me to be. But it's funny, isn't it? How people only begin to fear your strength once it's no longer convenient for them to ignore it. When you're small and silent, they pat your head and call you humble. But the moment you stand tall, they accuse you of arrogance. They question your motives, dissect your choices, and call it ambition like it's something dirty, something unfeminine, something unnatural coming from a daughter instead of a son. I watched them pour every ounce of belief into my brother, not because he earned it, but because it made sense to them. He looked the part, talked the part, and fit the story they wanted to tell at dinner parties. He was the one they bragged about while I was still taking meetings in coffee shops and filling shipping boxes in my apartment at midnight. But you know what I've learned? People don't root for the right person. They root for the person they've already decided they like, even if that person is all smoke and mirrors and borrowed charisma. And by the time they realize who is really doing the work, it's too late. I didn't need their validation. I stopped needing it long before the business changed hands, long before the papers were signed and the nameplate on the office door was replaced with mine. I didn't need their applause or their praise or their sudden, panicked attempts to rewrite the narrative. Because I knew what I had built. I knew what it had cost me, and I knew that no amount of denial could erase that. So when my father opened that envelope and saw my name on the ownership line, it wasn't a punchline to some cruel joke. It was a fact. It was the final entry in a story that had been unfolding for years, one slow page at a time. And when my mother looked at me with that stunned expression like she didn't even recognize me anymore, I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. Because I had already lived through the hardest part. The hardest part wasn't taking over the business. The hardest part was surviving the years when no one believed I could. And my brother? I don't hate him. I don't even blame him, not really. He was just playing the part they handed him. He was raised to believe he was the center of the universe, so of course he never saw the edges of the map where I'd been carving out my own place. He didn't see the warning signs because he never had to. And maybe that's the tragedy of it. He could have done better, could have learned more, could have been better if someone had held him accountable for more than 5 minutes. But they didn't. And now here we are. So no, this wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. This was me finally stepping into a role I had to build for myself from scratch, while everyone else assumed I'd stay quiet forever. This was me choosing to stop waiting for them to hand me a seat and deciding instead to build the damn table. Because I was never the backup plan. I was never the side note. I was the foundation they never realized they needed until the walls started caving in. And I know some people might say I should have been kinder, that I should have softened the blow, made it easier for them to digest. But here's the thing, people who've never made room for you don't deserve to be comfortable when you finally claim your space. They told me he was smarter. That he deserved the legacy. But legacies aren't inherited, they're built. And while they laughed behind the boardroom doors, I built mine quietly. And when it all came crashing down, I didn't scream. I just smiled and told them to check the mailbox.